anyone that's looking for the really bridge or the beginning of the High Renaissance, it really lies in this particular artist. And he's been in the news, and in the last couple years, people have rethought him. Of course, there was the Da Vinci Code, which is wildly unhistoric, and that's oops. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Oh, where was I? This painting that's been attributed to the school of Leonardo was recently cleaned, and it was in the news. And but it has, you know, this is as unpixelated as I can get it, but it's a very blurry sort of thing. And it's been around for a while. It's one of those many, many unfinished things that Leonardo da Vinci did during his career. In fact, I can't think of any other famous artist who obviously needs to be in any history of art who has finished less actual pieces. I think there's maybe 7 or 8 works that are known to be by him that are actually finished. He had a problem finishing things. And this did make him less influential than he would have been if more of his work kind of survived at his time. During his time, he was kind of noted as this mysterious, you know, genius. But Michelangelo and Raphael were people that were producing things all the time. And Leonardo, a lot of it was in his thought. A lot of it was in his notebooks. And those notebooks did not really surface until the 19th century, when people began to really look carefully at his notebooks, which are copious. But once again, his notebooks are filled with the beginnings of books, with the beginnings of essays, and so forth. It's almost like he's just so bright that he dives into something, and then he gets bored with it. Once he figures it out, he leaves it. And so we'll see this over and over again. It's a pattern in his life. Another, more recently, last year, this painting of St. Jerome in the Wilderness was on view at the Metropolitan Museum of Art just about a year ago. And it's an unfinished piece, but it does give us a glimpse into Leonardo's technique. Because unlike early Renaissance artists who worked in tempera, Leonardo was among the very first to utilize oil paint. And we don't know where he learned that. I think it was more experimentation, that he had seen some Flemish paintings and he decided to work on it himself. And this painting really reveals how he worked. He started off with a yellow coat and then started making more and more and more glazes on top of it. But this is one of the many unfinished pieces. Also, a couple of years, 2-3 years ago, this biography appeared, and it's quite good. I was wondering how he was going to deal with Leonardo, because Leonardo was such a mysterious person. Because even though we have a lot of his writing, none of it is revealing of his personal life or anything like that. A lot of where we get our biography is from Giorgio Vasari, who wrote a book, published a book around 1550, 30 years after Leonardo's death. That was a biography of his that was, you know, based on eyewitness accounts and that he had done. So I was wondering how Isaacson was going to do, because Einstein and Steve Jobs, that he had done biographies of previously, there's a lot more information on them than Leonardo. And actually, I have to say he does a good job of it. He does a lot of guessing, but he does make it kind of a very good story. And it's a much better, much truer way to become acquainted with Leonardo than with something like, you know, the Da Vinci Code, which is so full of errors. One of the things I don't like about this particular one is his, he deals with Leonardo's sexuality and says that he's gay and that one person was his lover and one person was the son he never had. And I don't know, I'm very dubious about taking categories from our modern times and applying them to the things of the past. I'm not saying there wasn't that kind of an element going on, but I think Isaacson, in weaving his story, that's kind of a subplot, that I think is so highly speculative that but it's a good story. So it's a good read, and it's not a highly technical book. You don't have to know a lot about art history to get involved. And so he does talk a lot about the surroundings of Leonardo, the intellectual surroundings, what else was kind of in the air, what were other people doing, and so forth. Okay. Now, what I want to differentiate is between the early Renaissance and the high Renaissance. Why do we have these two words for it? Renaissance means rebirth, and what was being reborn is the humanism and the idealization of the ancient Greeks and Romans after 1,000 years of what they called Dark Age. So the Renaissance, at least in Italy, was very self-aware of itself as a new, distinct thing with a history and with a tension against the Middle Ages. But when we say early and high Renaissance, that wasn't something that word that they used. Those came years later by art historians. But what we mean by that is that the same ideas, the same stylistic characteristics were taken farther, were taken higher in the high Renaissance. So there's still that balance, harmony, order, unity, all those kind of values, only it's greater unity, more harmony, and greater balance, greater complexity, greater sense of geometric construction, right? Everything kind of is, as that chef on the TV used to say, kick it up a notch, and that's actually what it was. And so early and high Renaissance are a really good way of us thinking of it, although we have to realize that those are categories that we're making up now, and it's not the same. So let's just take a look, just stylistically, at the difference. This is the face of Botticelli's Birth of Venus from, I guess, the 60s, the 1460s, and this is Leonardo's Mona Lisa, of course. We're just showing the face of it. But the first thing that's obvious is the difference in, I mean, a lot of the difference is due to the technique and the medium itself, because the Botticelli on the left is entirely a tempera painting, and Leonardo's Mona Lisa is an oil painting. There may be a tempera underpainting, but the Birth of Venus is executed completely in tempera. And tempera, the binder is egg yolk, so the binder is egg yolk instead of oil. And egg dries very fast. So when you make tempera and you're use a dry brush, and it almost is like drawing, right? You just have a stiff brush and you drag the brush across the surface, and you make these very clean lines. And so you can see, for example, in Venus, look at how the nose is articulated with lines, right? Whereas the Mona Lisa is just sort of a haze, and what the Italians call sfumato, which means smokiness, sfumato. And there's that quality of not being linear, but being kind of in soft focus. You can see it especially here, I think, in the line. Very clear line that demarcates the face and the chin. And look at the line here. I mean, there really isn't. It's a smudge. And the same thing, you know, over in this area. So and you can see it in the eyes, for example, an articulation of the eyes. So, and in the hair and so forth. And that comes largely from the medium. The medium, in attemperate dry, you drag the brush across the surface, almost like chalk. It has a real dry kind of feeling. Oil paint is very, very oily, and you use layers and layers. And Leonardo was really a master of it. Well, yeah, he was a masterful artist, but some of his experimentation with oil paint, which, as you remember, is really a new technique, were not successful. And we'll talk about that. We have to cut him a lot of slack because it was such a new medium that no one really knew what was going to happen to these paintings in 100 years and 200 years and so forth. And of course, The Last Supper is the most tragic of them all because it's just, you know, it's very hard to see, despite its recent restoration. Leonardo was born in 1452. He was an illegitimate child. the son of a notary, and we're not sure who. There's some speculation, a woman named Caterina that he seems to send money to later that he records in his notes, but it's all highly speculative. And he knew that he wasn't, that there was his stepmother, and he had brothers as well. And buon Marotti means the good notary. So that's a middle class family. But he showed such incredible abilities to draw that his father brought him to the studio of one of the really the best and most connected and most financially successful of artists in Florence at that time, Andrea Del Verochio. And his real name was Andrea di Michele Cioni, which I wouldn't have been able to see without saying it there. He's just called, Del Verrocchio means of the true. Verus is true. Occhio is eye, of the true eye, the true eye. Andrea the True Eye. All these Renaissance guys had nicknames. Leonardo didn't, but many of them did. So this is Verrocchio's studio. Verrocchio had a huge studio. He's one of the most successful artists commercially in Florence, if not always the deepest artist. I think you'd have to say, and this is a self-portrait, but I think you'd have to say that he is, I forget what I was saying. That he really preferred sculpture. But he had a studio that did everything. And there was also blacksmithing going on in his studio, as well as a foundry, and many assistants, and many paid assistants, and many apprentices. So it was a big family. And what happened during the Renaissance is, when you studied art, it was free if you were accepted into the studio, workshop of a maestro like Verrocchio. And Verrocchio had a lot of students. So if you weren't really good, he wouldn't bother with you, because education was free. For if you were talented and you worked, you could do it. Now, at that time, you actually moved into the house with the maestro. And so Leonardo lived in Verrocchio, the larger studio and the dormitories and so forth that were there. And he stayed there a long time, way past the time when other people kind of split their connections. But Verrocchio had such an incredible assistant in Leonardo that he could really give a lot of the work to him. And he's a very, very prolific artist. But you have to remember, at this time, it was a production. There were many, many people employed by Verrocchio to do every aspect of everything. And so he had a lot of assistants. And his studio was very successful, and he was just pumping out sculptures and paintings. It was very lucrative, and he did very, very well. And so he gets Leonardo when he's about 14, enters into the studio of Verrocchio. This bronze by Verrocchio, from about the time that Leonardo would have been studying with him during the late 60s, early 70s, 1470s. This is David. This is Verrocchio's David, long before Michelangelo's, of course. But this slender youth, Vasari, the biographer tells us that it was Leonardo that inspired this sculpture that he modeled for it. And it was very common to have your apprentices modeled for you. That was kind of, they were live-in, they would sweep up the place, they would do a lot of different things, learning their craft, but also modeling was part of it. And one of the things that was very delicate during the Italian Renaissance is it was not considered proper to have a female model, female nude model, and a male artist. And there were no women artists admitted to the guild, so there really weren't any professional women artists. Not they couldn't be, but they just were systemically cut out of the whole industry, I guess you'd call it, the whole artisanry. So anyway, this may very well be, and you can see this incredibly handsome face. And everyone said what a handsome man Leonardo was. He was not only, very gifted and the greatest scientist of his age, as well as the greatest artist and architect of his age, probably, but yet he was beautiful and handsome and said to be very, very strong and athletic, so that he, and he loved rose-colored clothing. It's why I wore my rose-colored shirt in honor of Leonardo today. But this may very well be a portrait of him. If you think of life as a game of cards, he was really dealt a royal flush because he could do everything. And painting really wasn't even the most important thing that he did. Here's a drawing from the workshop of Verrocchio. We're not sure who did it, but it looks like it was some sort of study for this sculpture. Yeah, it's incredible. He was an incredible craftsman. And so to learn the craft of painting and drawing from such an accomplished maestro, it gives them a real advantage. And of course, these guys also made connections so that if you were a successful apprentice and worked your way up to being a maestro, your mentor would help push you. And there was plenty of work to be done. There was a high demand for art. So prices of art went up exponentially during the late 1400s. And this went along with that change in status of the artist's position in society, as I mentioned in earlier lectures. From at the beginning of the 1400s, artist was an artisan, much in the same economic and social class as a baker or a blacksmith or those kinds of occupations. And as I always say it to my students, if you had a beautiful palazzo and the painters were doing a fresco, they would eat in the kitchen with the servants, not at the table with the people. But that all changed at the end of the 1400s, especially that circle around Lorenzo de Medici, led by Andrea Botticelli, which is also another nickname. But and Botticelli's work went for as much as 5 times as much as work from just a few years before. So people recognized this. And part of it was the idea that the artist, yes, he was a craftsman and he worked with his hands and he knew how to use materials skillfully. But also the artist was seen as a genius now. The artist was seen not just as a craftsman, but as someone who discerns the perfect forms as they are in the mind of God, and to give those perfect idealized forms physical presence by making visible the invisible. And I'm quoting here from Paul Klee, a 20th century artist, but I think it works as well for this. If there is a hidden, mysterious order to the universe and a perfection in the mind of the individual, not like our fallen world that has all sorts of problems and things like that, but an ideal world as God had wanted it when he created the world, if I can speak in that kind of a language of the time. And I lost my train of thought. But, oh yes, that the artist then is a genius. He's someone who discerns the perfect forms that are in the mind of God. So he has kind of a direct relationship to God. So this was seen as there's kind of 2 levels of artists now. There's the one that applies his trade and you can pay him some, but now there were this new breed of artists who were geniuses, who really seemed like they were touched by God. And the idea that they mix these ideas, these idealistic ideas they get from the Greeks and Romans, with Christian ideas about the incarnation, because Christians hold that Jesus is God incarnate. And that was kind of, in a way, what the artists were trying to do. They were trying to kind of incarnate that perfect forms that are in the mind of God and give them physical form, to make visible the invisible world that supersedes our world in its perfection. And there was a moral dimension to it as well, because the more we created spaces that were balanced, harmonious, and so forth, the more the social relations and political relations, economic relations would also become harmonious and balanced and orderly. So it was thought to have this morally uplifting effect on people and on society. So a very lofty idea of the artist. And Leonardo was sort of, much more than Botticelli, it turns out, really fits this role of the genius. I want to throw in this piece by Verrocchio, just because, he's often kind of overlooked and seen as the teacher of Botticelli and Perugino and many other people that went on to have very illustrious careers, and Leonardo really the most illustrious. But this is in the Ora San Michele, the Guild Hall in Florence, and there are these niches outdoors, and this is a bronze, and it's Doubting Thomas. The story in the New Testament is that Jesus has risen from the dead. Some of the apostles had seen him, but Thomas doubted it. He thought, you must have mistaken him or something like that. And then he actually sees Jesus himself. But before he said, I'll believe it when I put my, hands in the wounds. And so Jesus appears and said, here are the wounds. So here Thomas is reaching for that wound in Jesus's side as he sort of reveals, there's this kind of feeling of revelation. I love this sculpture. I mean, I think, and look at how he treats the, for example, the garments. And the interesting thing of the bronze, which is much more expensive to do than marble, but it's interesting how he kind of steps out of his niche like that. So there's that feeling of not being contained by any niche or any preordained thing, but being able to raise yourself to an incarnational kind of level. So I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about the art, is a kind of a sacramental thing of bringing into existence a perfect world that then we can model ourselves after. This is just, the craftsmanship is absolutely just beautiful and stunning and impeccable. But he also did painting. He didn't like to paint, Vasari says, but he was good at it. And you can see that he's very much, a maestro that would, Botticelli worked in his studio for a certain amount of time. And I think that he could easily be mistaken for Botticelli's work, the one who did the Venus that we saw the face at the very, very beginning of this lecture. And this is Mary with angels and Christ, painted in tempera. Writing gives you an idea of what he was doing. He's really a great craftsman, but you can see here again, this is a particularly lovely one, where you can really see those outlines, that linear quality, that dry brush quality that we see in there. Okay, now, here Leonardo first kind of enters the scene. The very earliest work we have by him is a collaborative piece with Verrocchio. And it must have been around 70, let's see, it must have been the 60s, because he was born in 52 and he entered the studio when he's 14. So he's in the late 60s. This is the baptism of Christ. And this is, Jesus is in the center, of course, and John the Baptist pours water over him. I think you can really see the limitations of Verrocchio in a painting like this. They just look so uninspired. To me, Jesus is this sort of, when do I get my lunch break? And, the Baptists almost look, okay, next. They all kind of look like they're tired of holding their poses or something like that. He has his moments, but painting he didn't like so much. But this one, he was able to give a whole section of the painting to his very talented journeyman, no longer an apprentice, a journeyman, here with this angel, and also this landscape in the background, very mysterious and strange. Now, one of the things that he does in this painting, even as a teenager, he decides that he's going to do his part in oil glazes. So the painting is a mix of, it's a temper painting, and then it's also Leonardo's section of it starts with a temper painting, and then there are those oil glazes. So this is among his very first experiments with the new medium. And it's interesting because Verrocchio never painted in oil, as far as I know. So Leonardo, he kind of gave Leonardo free rein. Go ahead, go for this angel. He does this one angel on the side. The other angel is probably by another apprentice. And I think when you look at them together, you can see, sublime face enraptured by the sacramental significance of what's happening. And, bored altar boy who'd rather be playing baseball than sitting in church, right? So it's a mixed painting at best. And it's almost like, to me, and it's in Florence, I've seen it many times, but it's almost like the Leonardo was so superior that it makes the whole rest, it ruins the painting. It destroys the unity of style in the painting. But let's take a look at it, because it's just, the expression is just absolutely sublime. These jewels that are in his cope are beautifully rendered, and that strange landscape in the background. That's the kind of smoky sfumato effect that you can really only get with oil paint. And you can just see, the thumbprints and the smudging and that kind of thing. Because remember, when we talked in our last lecture about oil paint was not typically even brushed on. It was using these little daubers. And I demonstrate this in class, but I can't really do it here. But you have a square of cotton. You put some cotton in some cloth and wrap it up and make it into a little bag. And you can have different kind of sizes of these. And these can be used both to put paint down, but also to take paint up. It will act as an eraser. And remember, unlike tempera, that you do it and 30 seconds later, it's dry. Oil paint is very long drying time. And you can add things to speed up the drying time or slow down the drying time. So there's a lot more availability of time. There's a much wider kind of window of opportunity of coming back to a painting and working with it. But we do know that they also have a great deal of there are many, many layers and layers that gives this smoky effect that we don't usually see in Italian work before that time. So that is one of his very first paintings. We have studies for them as well. Another painting that's also in Florence, because it's from the very early part of the career of the artist, is this Annunciation. And here the angel Gabriel comes to Mary, kind of surprises her while she's at her desk. I hope you can see them all. I have images around, but I'm thinking you probably see it all. Here the angel, kind of nervous, appears to Mary, who is taken aback a little bit. If we look very closely at it, we can see with what, and this is probably a tempera underpainting and an oil overpainting. That is a typical kind of thing of that time. And one of the rules you have to respect when you do oil paint and you're doing many, many, many layers is each successive layer must be oilier than the layer underneath it, or it will crack. And so it's called fat over lean. So you start the painting with very lean paints. And of course, tempera doesn't have any oil in it. So you can do a lot of work in the underpainting with tempera, seal that off with varnish, and then begin with your oil additions to it. Mary is in surprise. I think he does a beautiful job here of this marble pedestal or writing desk or whatever it is. And now he also does studies for them, because he's really young, he's like 20. And here's a study of the drapery of the Virgin. You can see there her knees. So these people worked all this stuff out very much beforehand. Oil paint was not the way, the Impressionists, they just paint all at once. This is broken down into many different steps, but these drawings are very interesting. They're very, very rich. And you can see that what he does is he begins with the middle tone. The paper is not white paper. The paper is sort of light brown or yellowish paper. And then he works down to the darks from the middle tone. And then he uses white to work up highlights from that middle tone. And it gives us a very, very rich
Dennis, we can't hear you. Dennis? We can't hear. Okay, we couldn't hear you for a minute. Okay.
It just came on and says your internet connection is unstable. So I'm hoping we don't get cut off.
You'll be all right. I get that once in a while. Okay.
Yeah, but sometimes it really happens here. But okay.
Talk faster.
Yeah, right. This one's the same color as my shirt. So the darkest tone is like the most saturated tone. But when we go to Leonardo, you see he starts from a middle tone. and works down to the shadows, which you can achieve amazing rich darknesses with oil paint, and then stumbles up to the light areas, wiping sometimes it away. When you look very, very closely, as these paintings have been examined, you do find a lot of thumbprints and stuff. He did a lot of painting with his thumb, as kind of smudging and doing that kind of thing out of it. Also, we see that in the background, he uses this rich atmospheric perspective, it's called. And that is, the farther something is away from the viewer, the bluer and the hazier it becomes. So the contrast between the sky and the mountains is reduced the farther it gets away, and the colors turn bluish. And depending on the atmospheric conditions, if it's very foggy, the blue comes sooner than if it's not. And this is kind of a hazy day, and we see into the distance. Actually, we know now that the eye can only perceive yellow and red to a certain distance, and beyond that, we can't perceive them. And so blue is the one thing that we can see. So anything that's really far away, the mountains are blue, the moon looks blue, right? And that's called atmospheric perspective. And the more of that, and it's related to sfumato that we saw in Leonardo's work as well. This again is an immature painting. I mean, it's not quite gelled the way a really mature Leonardo, but boy, it's certainly a promising beginning. Okay. Another very early painting, and the only Leonardo, I think, in the Western Hemisphere, is this portrait of Vinci. I forget her first name, but it was, a commissioned portrait, and it's very early. And it has, again, it's an oil paint. It has these exquisite details, like these hairs that were, individually, painted in. And this, of course, is a very much of a close-up. There's another painting by Lorenzo De Crede, one of the artists that was also in Verrocchio's studio and was very influenced by Leonardo. And we can see the kind of similarity to the dark tree in the background to highlight the contrast of the very light face against this dark background. And the hands especially have this wonderful grace that reminds us very much of a Leonardo drawing from the notebooks. Here again, he's not using white paper. He's using this, tan colored paper, working down with black chalk to the darknesses, working up with white chalk to the lightness, and they have this wonderful grace. And this is an interesting thing that I found in a speculative art historical, Photoshop conception, where they took the drawing of the hands and actually put them into the body, because we know that the painting had been trimmed. We know that probably to fit a frame or something. It's in Mona Lisa too, was the sides were cut off, so we don't get really the composition. It resembles very much Verrocchio's beautiful marble statue of the woman with posies, and it's just elegant. And the wonderful idealization and the wonderful gentleness of the hands, I just find it exquisite. And how the very, very light, sheer, like silk fabric reveals the forms underneath, the muscles, the breast, the arm. It's just as elegant and graceful. And you think of that grazie, right? Grace is, which also means thank you. It really does seem to incarnate this wonderful sense of grace. And those hands, this is Leonardo is looking at the work of his maestro. This is a very strange wax piece, and it's been damaged. It was originally colored, and it was entered our awareness in the first decade of the 20th century. It was bought by a German collector, and now it's in the Berlin Museum. It was attributed to Leonardo da Vinci from his early work, and it does resemble, or Verrocchio, it might well, but how did this wax thing survive? There's another theory, though, that it was done in the style maybe as late as the 19th century. So it's a dubious piece. But, when when forgeries are this good, it reminds me of a funny anecdote. There was a Picasso museum in Barcelona that opened in the 1960s, and it's still there now. And it had a lot of different Picassos, especially early Picassos. And Picasso came to the opening, and he went around to the catalog, and he noted there were a dozen or so that were forgeries that he had never painted himself. And so they had to remove those forgeries. But there was one or two that he thought, gee, I wish I would have painted them so well, so that he signed them. So they kind of become, paintings by that thing. But I mean, it's very graceful and lovely, and reminds us that gentle smile. If it's a forgery, it's such a good one. This is one of the earliest, one of the most ambitious commissions he does during his early 20s as well, and it was for a monastery there in Florence. And it was unfinished. And it's also in Florence, so it's another painting that I'm very familiar with. Then you can see what he does. It's different than what the Flemish did with oil painting, what Bellini did with it when we saw in our last lecture. And that is that he uses this a yellow-orange, this kind of amber color, that the whole panel is covered with this. I'm not sure if it's canvas or a wood panel, but the whole thing is covered with this yellow that we see, right, this very warm orange yellow, which kind of glows through layers and layers of the paint later on, and gives it a sort of coloristic unity. Because when the Flemish did it, they came up with a technique. They would take the individual thing for the blue of the Virgin's dress and paint that in first. And so the underpainting was made of all these kind of different pieces of the composition. But when you get to a painting like this, what he does is he does the whole thing in this glowing yellow and then begins to work into it. And here we can see that he has introduced these earth browns, looks like burnt sienna, burnt umber, kind of orangish, very warm browns, not cool browns, and even darker tones here and there. Over here, I need to, that's better. Over here, there are a lot of figures that kind of emerge from the darkness, and here you can see it. It's amazing. It's as if everything is sort of this one dark matrix of smokiness, of sfumato, and these figures kind of emerge out of that smoky background, that murky background. This has been conjectured might be a self-portrait. That's Vasari says a lot of these things in his biography, but Vasari also was a storyteller, and all the things he said are not necessarily accurate. But here you can see he's doing a lot of things. I mean, first of all, he establishes the composition, he establishes the lights and darks, and he's all ready for the painting. And I just realized that this is definitely a panel, because I can see the seams here. Can you see that? These seams, because if the danger of having one piece of wood, and this may be a meter by meter, it's almost square, it can warp. And so what they often did is make panels where they would change the grain so that the warping would even it out. So this is definitely a wood panel. And it's very exquisite. He does drawings in his notebook, and look at the perspective that he's worked out here for this thing. It's incredible. This also is from this early period, and we talked about this at the very beginning of the lecture. Saint Jerome in the wilderness. He was one of the desert fathers. He is accompanied there by a lion. This was no doubt a commission that again he took up, but he didn't finish. The background has that hazy kind of blue, oil paint quality. But again, you can see he paints the canvas, or the wooden panel, I'm sorry. The panel is painted in this warm yellow orange. And then he goes in to work the various different textures. Now, the next thing would be to start glazing in the skin tones, whatever color this robe would be, that would begin to be laid in, the color of the lion's coat, his fur, and so forth. So this is a painting that was abandoned. It was also a painting, it has a very strange story. It's in the collection of the Vatican museums. But you see this square right here? You see there's kind of a square like that. And that was a hole for a couple hundred years. And then, I think it was the early part of the 20th century, someone found in a junk shop in Tuscany, in Italy, a stool that had this face on it, this square stool. And they bought it, and it changed hands, I guess, and they thought, gee, it looks like it could fit into this painting that we just have a hole there. And they took it to the Vatican, and it fit in, and they fit it right in. They cut off the legs. Can you imagine cutting up a Leonardo da Vinci to make a stool? You know, if I were a writer, if I were a fiction writer, I think I could weave a whole story about how that got to be a stool in a junk store. But they've replaced it, and this is the one that was on exhibit on loan from the Vatican. As I said, you know, it's in early stages of completion, but it's quite. And here you can see very clearly that square. And Saint Jerome, he's hitting himself with the rock because he's repenting. He was kind of fasting in the wilderness, one of those desert fathers. And he's the one that supposedly translated the New Testament from from Greek into Latin, rather. That became the version of the New Testament the Catholics used ever since. Leonardo, around the age of 30, accepts a call to be the court artist for Lodovico the Moor, who is the Grand Duke of Milan. Milan is in the very northern part of Italy, and it's right next to the Swiss. You know, you can see the Alps from Milan. And Leonardo applied for the job. Now, this was an old-fashioned kind of job. You know, his maestro, Verrocchio, was a self-employed businessman. So he did his books, he paid his taxes, he clothed his apprentices and so forth, and he ran a business. He was very independent. So if you came to Verrocchio and you said, I want you to paint a picture of my wife, and he said, I'm sorry, I don't want to do that. Maybe he just doesn't like you. He doesn't like, I don't know, your hair or something. He could do that, and you couldn't force him to do anything. So that independence was an important part of most artists' life. A more old-fashioned version was what the Duke of Milan had, and that is a court artist. And a court artist is not paid for job by job, but he's given a salary, and he's just like on call, and he lives in the palace. So the Duke advertised, and Leonardo applied, and we actually have his letter that he wrote in application, and he's telling the different things that he can do, and he mentions he can engineer bridges, he can build dams and locks, that he can to regulate water, that he can divert water into irrigation systems for agriculture, that he could do architecture, that he could build machines of war, that he lists all these different things that he can do. And then at the very end, he puts painting, as if that's the very least of the many things that he can do. And he really was a Renaissance man in that sense, is that he could really do a number of different things. And a lot of his work is really not, a lot of his work from Milan, when he worked for Lunovico the Moor, he moved into the court, and he kind of became not only the resident artist, but kind of the resident genius that Lodovico boasted about, that he had, the brightest mind in all of Europe, working as basically a well-paid servant, and had a suite of rooms, so his studio and so forth, there in the Palazzo, the palace in Milan, and it's still there, the Palazzo Sforza. And Lunovico the Moor was an interesting patron. He was a very brutal man, and he could actually, um, there was a gangster-like quality to a lot of his dealings. He had sort of seized the throne from a young prince, of who he was the teacher, and the prince fled Milan, fearing for his life because Lodovico was a rather unsavory and very ambitious man, and he fled to the court of France, where he was given refuge. And so Lodovico ran the show for a while, for decades, and but then eventually was overthrown when the French, looking for an excuse to invade Italy, said, well, they were going to restore the true Duke of Milan and get rid of Lodovico. Lodovico Sforza. Sforza means force, and it was a nickname. But he is sometimes also called Lodovico the Moor. That's what he's better known as. And because he had very, very dark complexion, and there were rumors that he was of mixed, ethnicity, that gave him that very dark, uncharacteristically dark skin, and so they called him the Moor. And he ruled Florence. I mean, he ruled Milan as an autocrat. It wasn't the kind of situation as Florence was, much more democratic, ruled by a council that rotated. And it wasn't really democracy in our sense, but it was much closer to that. Milan was really an oligarchy, and it was ruled from the top down, and Leonardo was the right-hand man of Lodovico. His most famous piece that he did while he was in Milan is for the monks at the Santa Maria della Grazie monastery, the Last Supper, the famous Last Supper. It's in incredibly rough shape, and you can see that the monks put a door in here at one point. So the painting has suffered a lot over the years. And there are many unfinished paintings from this period that he spent in Milan under with Lodovico the Moor. And he was called on to do a lot of different stuff, including, for example, writing music that would be kind of background music for banquets. Lodovico the Moor liked to have parties. He liked to have these grand kind of balls, and he showed off his resident genius by doing all sorts of strange kind of things. He liked costume parties. So we find Leonardo, has designs for costumes, strange costumes. It's supposedly he designed a mechanical lion that leapt forward and its mouth opened and lilies came out. These are descriptions we have, but it's almost like performance art that he's doing there for Lunovico the Moor. This is one of these small unfinished paintings that he did during that period of a young musician. The man is holding a manuscript, so he's perhaps a singer at court. But you can see the face is pretty finished, but he didn't finish a great deal of the rest of it was not finished. But Lunovico, in a way, was a bad influence on Leonardo because he frittered away his time. Leonardo was writing, chamber music, none of which exists anymore. He was doing different things, including, for example, the ceiling of the banqueting hall in the Palazzo Sforza in Milano. And this is the ceiling. He painted these vines, elaborate vines, intertwining on the ceiling. And I'm not sure if it's fresco. I mean, but here's a close-up of it, beautifully executed. But there are a lot of people who could paint vines on the ceiling nicely. Why, use a Leonardo for that kind of a thing? So in a way, Lunovico the Moor kind of frittered away Leonardo's time. But one of the things that sort of endured from the period, at least the remnants of it, it's very damaged, is the Last Supper that's in the refectory or the dining room of the Santa Maria delle Grazie monastery in Milano. I have a whole bunch of stuff, but I think perhaps I see 11:53. If we're going to get questioning, perhaps this is a good point to stop, and we can return to look at this very beautiful but incredibly flawed, technically flawed masterpiece that has really been restored. It looks better now than it has for the last 500 years, perhaps. And I've seen it before the restoration began as well. But still, it has a lot of problems because he insisted on using oil paint on a wall. And that's a very precarious kind of a technique to carry out. See, Leonardo disliked fresco wall painting, which is where you paint directly into fresh plaster. While it's still kind of warm, it's not soupy, it's solid, but it's still warm. And there's about a 6 to 8 hour window of opportunity. So what one would do is to take, for example, just these two figures, this part, and put plaster in there, let it set up, and do that in the 6 hour period. Leonardo did not like that. He really loved the time to lavish on oil paint. Unfortunately, what he did is the underpainting is in tempera, and tempera is egg tempera. And then he put layer upon layer upon layer of oil paint on top of that. And oil paint, we talked earlier about fat over lean. Well, if you do 30 glazes, it gets pretty heavy. And especially because there's nothing to really bind the oil to the wall. Because instead of painting it into wet plaster, he plastered the whole thing, let it completely dry. Then he went in with egg tempera. Well, you could think about it. Just think about it. Egg yolk. Let's say you take some egg yolk and you brush it on a wall and it dries. Then if you put layer upon layer upon layer, you can just, you can kind of imagine how it might have looked okay for a little while, but the oil paint began to separate. The tempera wasn't enough. Egg is not enough. An egg yolk mixture is not enough to really adhere oil glazes to a dry plaster wall. So we'll return to that. One of the things I just wanted to mention is that, he could have done a little better homework because there are dinner rolls on the table. If this is Passover, there should be matzah instead of Italian dinner rolls. So, okay, let's stop at this point and open it up for questions, if I may.
Do you want to, stop sharing, okay. Do you want to stop sharing?
Yeah, that would
there
be
we
fine.
go.
Yeah.
There we go, okay.
Quite a few people. Good.
Yes, you have quite a group here. I just want to say, Dennis, it is so wonderful to listen to you. I feel not only am I getting, let me just so you can see me. I'm not only getting a really wonderful full art lecture, but I love all the anecdotals and things you talk about. So we see it in history exactly the way it is. It's something you do especially well. So thank you.
Well, it's a great story.
It is, yeah.
So it's hard to botch it, I think, when you got work.
No, but you do a really good job. You do a good job. We've been working together for a number of years, but I just wanted to compliment you on the consistency and quality of the lectures that you do.
May I say something?
Sure.
Dennis speaks with the passion of an artist, and I know he is an artist.
Mm-hmm.
I received a call from the doctor, so I missed a couple of seconds there. Did you speak about, or are you planning to speak about, Da Vinci